Multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. Like, that's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world, and the world is full of war.
皆さん、こんにちは。この動画を後で全部流しますので、その前に簡単な背景の説明をします。今回、皆さんに紹介する動画は、左翼フェミニストとカナダの学者、ジョーダン・ピーターソンとの間の対話です。以前、ジョーダン・ピーターソンの字幕動画を皆さんに紹介したとき、彼のことを紹介したことがありますので、詳しい紹介は割愛します。彼はポリコレとアイデンティティ政治を批判する学者です。今までポリコレについてこのチャンネルで何回か話をしたことがあります。でも、アイデンティティポリティクスについてあんまり話をする機会がありませんでした。今回の動画はそれを知る短くて良い動画です。今回の動画では、アイデンティティポリティクスだけではなく、多文化主義に関する話も出ます。多文化主義は近年とても話題になってますが、ピーターソンは同じ国の中で単純な多文化主義はありえないと考えています。最近、日本でも多様化が話題になっています。実は、同じ国で多様化を維持することは不可能ではありません。しかし、それには重要な前提条件があります。その前提条件を失ってしまうと、社会は大きなダメージを受けます。では、その前提条件は何でしょうか？それについてまた動画の中で話をします。インタビューの途中で必要な解説をしていきます。短い動画になりますが、かなり勉強になるインタビューだと思いますので、ぜひ最後までご覧ください。では、どうぞ。
So I wonder if you and I mean the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism, because you have a First Nations room in your house, right? You have a lot of First Nations stuff. How is the coexistence
I'm the honorary member of a First Nations family, as a matter of
Which is
fact.
wonderful. I have a First Nations artist when I went to Canada last year. But that to me is the essence of Canadian multiculturalism, living that culture being preserved and living alongside the Anglophone culture that in some senses supplanted it. How is that not multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. Like, that's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world, and the world is full of war. So how can that possibly work? If you're going to bring people together and they're going to exist together in harmony, they have to be playing a game that everyone plays, that everyone knows the rules for. It can't be 10 different sets of rules for different people. That isn't going to work. So it's absolutely naive to believe. How, if that worked, the world wouldn't be full of war.
Well, before we had, multiculturalism, we still did have war. In fact, war is, as Steven Pinker, I'm sure you've read your Steven Pinker says, this is the least violent time in human history. So
yes,
something
well, that's
is
a consequence of
working.
The patriarchal tyranny.
Well, if you think that the patriarchy's been eroded over the last 100 years, maybe that's what it's down to. Maybe you could give some credit to it for that.
I actually didn't say that the patriarchy had been eroded.
Well, because you don't believe it exists in the first place. Fair enough. But my definition of multiculturalism is citizenship-based, right? So you can be both Canadian and First Nations. You can be both Quebecois and also Canadian.
But that means that everybody in the multicultural milieu is one thing and another.
Right.
But they're all one thing and another.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, our Prime Minister said, well, there is no Canadian identity. It's like, well, okay, what is it that unites us? Well, nothing. We all protect our cultures. It's like, well, that leads to war.
Okay,
It doesn't only lead to war, obviously, but unless you have people operating within a shared framework of perception and value, they can't cooperate and compete peacefully. I don't understand how that's even a disputable topic. That's how you organize people.
ここで彼が言ってることはとても大事だと思います。同じ国の中で違う文化を持つ人が共存する前提条件は、その国で生活している人がまず共通の認識、ルールなどを認識しないといけません。全員を団結させる共通の理念が存在しないといけません。例えば、アメリカという最も多文化が共存している国を例にしますと、アメリカは長い歴史がある 単一の民族でできた国ではありません。アメリカを一つの国にして団結させているのは、アメリカの憲法に記載されている自由、平等、民主、法治などの共通理念です。それらの理念がベースにあって、それを守った上で、各人種や民族が自分の特有の文化を守ってきます。でも、今の左翼はそのベースを破壊して、単純に人種で人を分けようとしています。それは当然、アメリカ国内での人種間の緊張感を上げることになってしまいます。では、日本の場合はどうなるのか。もし、どうしても日本に大量な移民を受け入れないといけない場合、それらの移民はいつか日本社会の一部になって、これから長年一緒に暮らすということを認識しないといけません。では、その時、日本にいる全員をつなげるベースにあるものは何か、それをどう新しく来た人に認識してもらって、守ってもらうのかなどを最初に考えないといけません。移民を一旦受け入れると、簡単に追い出すことはできません。日本社会内部での対立が起きてしまう前に、これらのことを考えないと、いつか日本社会もダメージを受けることになります。今、このタイミングでこの話を言うのは良くないと思われるかもしれませんが、例えば、中国で宗教が政権を握っているのではなく、普通の政府が同じ法律基準を守って、全員が本当の意味で平等に暮らせる国にしたなら、今、中国で起きている少数民族に対する弾圧もなかったでしょう。同じ国の中で同じ基準ではなく、違うグループに違う対応をすることは、人を分断させる最悪のやり方です。
Okay, I think if that's what he said, that's what Trudeau said, that is a dumb thing for the Prime Minister of Canada to say when you are Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah, you might say that.
Would agree
all right.
much more with what Barack Obama said when he said, you know, I'm trying not to make a red states America or blue states America or white America, black America. I'm trying to make a United States America. That to me
Yes,
is...
the Democrats are very good at that.
Well, they
Played identity politics for the last 20 years. All they've done is inflame tribal tendencies, as far as I can tell. So he can say that, but it isn't obvious that it's the case. And it's not obvious to me at all that one of the consequences of Barack Obama's presidency was a reduction in racial tension in the United States.
No, I wouldn't agree with that either. I think a lot of people found having a black college-educated professor very alarming and threatening to their idea of themselves as the dominant group.
To stop them from voting for him twice.
No, that is very true. But again,
it's fundamentally true, right? It's really the crucial issue at hand here.
No, but he built a big coalition of white, well-educated liberals and people of colour. I mean, that is the Democrat electoral.
Well, how do you explain the rise of racial tension in the United States then?
Well, I think it's caused by a lot of things, not least of one of which is the Republican Party inflaming it. You talk about the left playing identity politics. I think the right play identity politics all the time.
The right doesn't dominate the universities.
No,
and
but it dominates.
But
Donald Trump is president, so realistically,
Donald Trump is hardly a typical Republican.
No, I would say that he accomplished.
In fact, for most of his life, if I remember correctly, he was a Democrat.
Right. I don't think he has any
so
political.
So we're not going to blame Donald Trump on the right wing.
Okay, but I'm going to say the rest of the Republican Party are also quite happy to play, I would say, white identity politics. They did not dump him as their candidate when he said, Mexicans, they're not sending us their best people here, they're rapists, right? The whole idea of the United States, it said, I think a beautiful thing, all men are created equal, but it meant men, and it meant specifically white men. Women and black people could not vote. The US was founded on identity politics. This is not some new concept that has come along in the last 20 years.
The United States wasn't founded on identity politics.
Yes, it was.
That's absolutely absurd proposition. The United States was founded on the same principles that, what would you say, that played their powerful role through the development of English democracy. And that was nested inside a Judeo-Christian view that fundamentally presumed that both men and women were made in the image of God and that all people had divine value. And it took a long time for that set of ideas to fully manifest itself in the political realm. But to consider that a manifestation of identity politics is, I can't imagine why you would possibly do that.
ここで彼はとても重要なことを言ってると思います。アメリカの建国の理念はある種の価値観です。一つの価値観を政治の世界で十分に具体化していくには長い年月が必要です。アメリカが建国してからも奴隷制度がありました。 女性に投票権がなかったなどのことはよく批判されます。もちろん、今の視点で当時のことを見ると、それは間違っています。これについてまた他のコンテンツを作成してますので、できましたらまた皆さんに紹介します。その価値観を実践させるために、アメリカで内戦まで起きて、奴隷制度が廃止され、徐々に女性の参戦権が守られるようになり、公民権運動で人種間の平等も促進されました。それまでアメリカは正しい方向に向かっていたと思いますが、今になってアメリカは人種やアイデンティティで社会を分断させるという間違った方向に向かってしまっています。もちろん他にも同じことが起きている国があります。
I don't consider that a manifestation of identity politics. I consider having a constitution that says only some people are citizens to be a manifestation of identity politics.
Well, what do you think changed it across time? And look, let's get our definitions straight here. You can't lump all occurrences of non-equal treatment into the category of identity politics. Identity politics is a very specific thing. It's really only existed since the 1970s. You can't go back to 1770 and say that the founders of the American Constitution were playing identity politics.
They were playing politics that was based on identity. That's my definition of identity politics.
That's not the definition of identity politics unless you play fast and loose with the definition. Identity politics is something that's... No one talked about identity politics 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It's a new term. You can't say that people's proclivity to identify with their group is identity politics. That's just tribalism. And that's like, who knows how old that is? 1,000,000 years old. 500,000 years old. And you're going to call tribalism identity politics? Well, that's not helpful. If you want to talk about tribalism, we could talk about tribalism. But identity politics is something that's nested inside a particular political view of the world. It's got a Marxist basis, and it manifests itself in postmodernism. And it emerged in the France first in the 1970s, and then has swept through the American universities and increasingly the rest of the West since then. That's identity politics. If you want to talk about tribalism, that's fine. I'm not a fan of tribalism, which is why I don't like the identity politics types. And I don't care if they're on the right or the left. I think the right-wing use of identity as the primary marker for human categorization is as reprehensible and dangerous as it is on the left. My problem with the left at the moment, the fundamental problem with the radical left, is that they're hyper-dominant in academia. And that's not good. And that's not my opinion. You can go look at Jonathan Haidt's data and see for yourself. And he's as moderate a person as you could hope to find, and probably less prone to anger than me.
And I agree with you. I find a lot of students phenomenally irritating, but I would question how much power they have in contrast to the things that I find more worrying that are happening in the world today, right? Or even the professors, right? Even professors.
20-year-olds don't have that much power, but they're not 20 forever. 10 years later, they're 30. And 20 years later, they're 40.
Right.
And whatever happens in the university happens everywhere 5 years later.
And very, very sadly for people in my politics, left-wing politics, what happens to people as they get older is that they've traditionally got more conservative. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you can make a case that the current, where people are when they're 20 today is actually going to be the ideology that takes them all the way through their life. That's never been the case so far.
No, but it'll be around long enough to do plenty of damage, like it already is.
Okay, but even if we accept that students and their POMO professors are quite annoying, which I think is probably something I agree with.
They're not just annoying. Like, they're destroying the universities, and that's not a good thing. And they're particularly destroying the social sciences and the humanities. The sciences are safe so far, but not for long, because the scientists in particular are terrible at politics, and the left-wing activists are great at politics. And so they'll win eventually. The National Science Foundation is already introducing diversity requirements for hiring in mathematics in universities. It's like, good luck with that. That's not going to work. There are hardly any mathematical geniuses. If you start putting all sorts of arbitrary restrictions on their hiring, you're going to end up not finding the ones that there are.
アイデンティティポリティクスというのは、人を人種や身分で分けることで、人をカテゴライズ化します。それによって、そのカテゴリーは特定の集団になります。このようなことを推し進めているのは、一般国民ではなく、 特定の目的を持つ政治集団です。彼らは社会を加害者の階級と被害者の階級に分けます。例えば、白人と黒人。特定の集団を作り上げた後、彼らの問題を解決してあげる。だから自分を支持してくださいと投票を獲得してきます。そうするために、彼らには被害者意識を持たせて、特定のグループが特定の待遇をもらうのは当たり前という意識を教えてきます。これは結局、社会の分断につながります。2015年、オバマ政権の時、いわゆる専門家たちはメリーランド州の人口調査を行っていた機関で会議を行って、中東、北アフリカから来た人に新しい人種のカテゴリーを作ることについてディスカッションをしました。それはオープンなディスカッションになりますので、記録に残っています。でも、実際中東から来た人はそれにあんまり興味がないようです。専門家たちは、もし彼らがこのカテゴリーからベネフィットを得ることができるとすれば、彼らは真っ先にそのカテゴリーを支持することになると言いました。このようなことからも、誰がこのようなアイデンティティポリティクスを推し進めているのがわかります。アメリカは最初から違う人種や民族でできている国です。もちろん、各人種の割合は時代の変遷によって変わってきました。1910、20年代、一部の学者はアメリカを多文化国家に変えたいと主張しました。しかし、当時の共和党、民主党のリーダー、大統領、最高裁判所から否定されました。なぜなら、それはアメリカという国のアイデンティティに関わるとても重要なことだからです。アメリカは共通の理念がある国で、単純な多文化主義の国ではないからです。でも、今、左翼はアイデンティティ政治を利用してアメリカを破壊しています。それを利用して自由言論を制限し、人の思想を制限します。それだけではなく、ピーターソンが言ったように、今、人文社会科学は破壊されています。それから理系まで破壊されてしまうと、社会の発展にも大きな影響が出ます。そのポジションに適切な人は、白人だから採用されず、才能を発揮することができない可能性がありますし、そのポジションに適切ではない人は、特別な人種だから採用されて、最後まで結果を出せずに、中退したり、大きな失敗をしたりして、社会の資源の浪費につながります。これらのすべてはアメリカを破壊することになります。幸い、それに気づいて、それと戦っている人はいますが、まだまだ足りません。これはアメリカ社会、または世界にも大きな影響を与えることになりますので、またこれからも引き続き皆さんに紹介するようにします。これからもこのような話をしていきますので、ご興味がある方はぜひフォロー、コメント、拡散をお願いします。また、このチャンネルを応援していただける方は、ぜひメンバーシップもご検討ください。では、また次回お会いしましょう。ハラノタイムズがお届けしました。